Well, now it's time for me to invite Mr. Weatherby to speak on behalf of what we call the G3.
Indeed.
Yes, Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you very much. I'm going to address you on three areas, if I may. Firstly, some general comments on the disaster and the high-level general conclusions that the Phase 1 expert evidence unquestionably points towards in terms of fundamental non-compliance with building regulations and the reckless disregard for human lives that is represented by the multiple failures in design, materials, fabrication, build, oversight of the refurbishment and the maintenance of the building itself. Secondly, I'll pick the baton up from Danny Friedman regarding the London Fire Brigade and candour and the comments of Danny Cotton in particular and the nature and prevalence of institutional defensiveness more generally and how we say the inquiry should deal with it. And thirdly, and most substantially, I'll turn to the two main themes regarding the LFB emergency response, the lack of any contingency planning, in particular the failure to have or to improvise a plan B to evacuate the tower, and the failure of the FSG process actually on the fire ground itself. These were, in our submission, the key systemic failures on the part of the LFB, which almost certainly led to a greater loss of life. In doing so, I'll endeavour to remain within my 1 hour, and I hope you won't be too annoyed if I stray slightly over it. As has already been stated, the Grenfell fire was certainly a preventable calamity, designed, manufactured and built, not accidental. And we join with others in urging you to make that clear in the interim report. There was no natural cause, no act of God. No matter how many times certain witnesses and core participants repeat terms like unprecedented and unique, which we've heard this morning, or perfect storm, it's impossible to get away from the catalogue of failures that the inquiry experts in particular have already spoken to. I'm not going to repeat that evidence. Stephanie Barwise has already addressed you comprehensively on that. But a particular feature of the expert evidence is the fact that there is such a high degree of agreement between the various experts with only minor shades of difference. Also, although there is some challenge to the Phase 1 expert evidence in written closings by one or two of the corporate CPs, the areas of challenge are relatively narrow, and there does not appear to have been any provision of contrary expert opinion, as no doubt that would have been disclosed more generally. The expert evidence provides a long list of failures, gross failures, not just the combustible cladding, both outer rain screen and insulation, but the altered window position, creating dangerous voids packed with combustible foam, membranes and insulation. UPVC window surrounds, polystyrene infill panels, all highly combustible. The lack of cavity barriers, front doors without closers, different from those tested for fire resistance. The lack of firefighter lifts, no plans for evacuating vulnerable residents, and no mitigation of those risks. Just some of the obvious and gross deficiencies with the building and its management. A building, let no one forget, with one staircase, no sprinklers and no general alarm. A building populated with many elderly people and children, those with disabilities and mobility issues, those particular features being well known to relevant public authorities such as the owner and landlord, RBKC and the TMO. And also those who designed and undertook and signed off the refurbishment and those who were supposed to regulate it, and indeed the fire service for today's purposes. Let me pose a shorter list, and I do it as a question. On the evidence, what parts of the refurbishment were done to anything approaching a reasonable fire safety standard? Which active or passive fire safety provisions were appropriate and functioning on the night? That is a very short list, if it's a list at all. Dr. Lane referred to fundamental non-compliance with BR B4 in her report. We would take that opinion further and submit that such a catalogue of failure shows a reckless disregard for human life by those involved in the design and build of the refurbishment project, those who manufactured and marketed the products, and those who undertook the works, and those who failed to quality assure and properly sign it off. We'd also add, and a point we'll press in Phase 2, that while there was fundamental non-compliance with building regs, and shocking disregard for the guidance in ADB, that no reasonable designer or procurer in our submission would in any event see ADB as providing all the answers. Properly viewed, it's a risk assessment tool, a list of the considerations that should be brought into play in considering life safety, not a blueprint for safe design. To view ADB otherwise is to ignore the complexity of modern cladding systems and the obvious known risks they posed. Although there'll be much more work to do in Phase 2, you've commissioned and published, called and heard considerable and detailed evidence about the comprehensive and gross non-compliance with any reasonable standard. And we join with all of the other bereaved and survivors and displaced residents teams in urging that you set out headline conclusions in the interim report so that Phase 2 can focus on just where those gross failures were, who's accountable for them, and why it was all allowed to happen. A community turned into a war zone in prosperous Kensington and Chelsea, in a country in a position to have high regulatory and health and safety standards. The detail of the failures and who did what, just when and why, may be the subject of close consideration of emails and contracts and technical drawings, but the broad picture is clear for all to see. As I address you now, many bereaved and survivors, the victims, suffer severe psychological effects of the night. Many lost family and friends, and all lost community. Many of my clients, no doubt others too, are still to settle in new homes. They're looking for answers. 18 months has passed. No one has taken any responsibility for the disaster. And that is a major open sore for the bereaved and the survivors. All of the corporate and public authority institutions are big on condolences and sympathy, but as a generality, repeated in the recent written closings, they say, in effect, it was all a series of unfortunate and unforeseen events. It was not their fault because their product was not used correctly. It was for someone else to check the specification, the build quality, to sign the work off. The regulations weren't clear. So far, the inquiry has only had a book of excuses. I've made this point before, but I need to repeat it. The written closing arguments are more of the same. Arconic point at the insulation, not the ACM. They state the Phase 1 expert evidence, quote, establishes that it was a confluence of unfortunate circumstances and not the mere presence of ACM-PE, which created the conditions for the Grenfell fire. Kingspan point at the configuration, but since the fire they've been marketing the same product for use on high-rise residential buildings. Celotex say what amounts to nothing. Studio E and Harley's The Cladders actually say nothing, no closing at all. Whirlpool say there's not enough evidence to find the fire started in their appliance, Bridge Freezer. Ryden say the fire must have escaped only through the open window, not via the menu of combustible products that they arranged to be packed around the windows or the voids. Phase 2 will not be concerned so much with what actually happened, the fire and the dangerous state of the building on the night, but why it was allowed to happen, who was responsible for the overarching failures of design, procurement, compliance, build quality, quality control, sign-off, lack of maintenance, who's accountable for the particular aspects of the building failure. So not much help from the corporate CPs on this so far, or indeed public authorities either, as I'll come to in a minute. Candour. Mr. Friedman has spent some time on the culture of the London Fire Brigade and the disappointing view of Danny Cotton, who concluded her evidence, quote, "I wouldn't change anything we did on the night," unquote. And I just want to pick that particular baton up and run with it a little further. Firstly, though, a very important clarification, and so important that I make no apology whatsoever for repetition. LFB did not put manifestly dangerous cladding on Grenfell Tower. They didn't cause the fire. I join with most others in recognising the courage of the many firefighters who risked their lives to save others. And that isn't just a trite statement. Although others raise a number of issues regarding the conduct of particular firefighters or the control room, The context is that firefighters going into the tower must have had images of collapsing buildings in their minds, and they went into conditions where they could not see anything because of the smoke. And we've actually seen that on various videos during the course of the evidence, a truly horrific fireground scenario. To borrow a phrase from Sid Ali at Marnie from the level 15, I direct my comments at the suits and not the helmets. Were LFB correct in their opening, indeed in their closing, in effect to say there was little that they could have done other than try and put the fire out and rescue individuals? Are they correct to say that valid criticisms are either to points of detail or from hindsight and were impossible to foresee? Is it right that the introduction of smoke hoods and a few changes behind the scenes to some of their policies will suffice at some point, undetermined in the future? We say that's a very disappointing stance, which not only ignores the reality of the evidence, but comes from an ingrained culture of denial. It's also dangerous because those who fail to learn the lessons of the past are going to repeat their failures in the future. In the face of a terrible tragedy, the response appears to be that it's the duty of senior managers to defend the institution in the face of the fact, rather than act with candour, accepting the stark reality of what the evidence shows. Did LFB learn the lessons from Lacanau? Why was there no evacuation contingency plan? Why did the FSG process fail so badly on the night? A culture of denial or institutional defensiveness not only prevents us all, the victims and the wider public as well, from learning what actually did and didn't happen. Not only does it make accountability more difficult to determine, but it also means that mistakes of the past will happen again and lives will be endangered. Danny Friedman spoke about the culture of the LFB. I'm not going to repeat that submission, but I want to widen it because it will continue to be relevant to the other public authority and corporate CPs in this inquiry. I've already demonstrated that by referring to the complete absence of anybody accepting either any wrongdoing or any failures to date. This isn't some unique or novel problem. It's well known, well documented by a series of inquiry reports and notorious cases that denial and defensiveness is the default position, not the exception of many, perhaps most institutions, both public and private. Sir Robert Francis recognised this as an endemic problem in his report into the Mid-Staff's NHS Foundation Trust. His recommendation led to a legal duty of candour being imposed on healthcare providers by the 2014 regulations. February 2015, the Equality and Human Rights Commission report Preventing Deaths in Detention of Adults with Mental Health Conditions recognised exactly the same problem in the deprivation of liberty sector. Dr. Kirkup's March 2015 report into failures of the Morecambe Bay NHS Trust picked up the same mantle, again recognising the need for a duty of candour, specifically in the way that institutions prevented their evidence at inquests, and in a recommendation indicated the specific need for regulation in that area. July 2015, the Harris Review, report of the independent review into self-inflicted deaths in custody of 18 to 24-year-olds, the theme again arose, a specific mention of institutional defensiveness. The Bishop's report into Hillsborough, with which I'm sure you're familiar, recognised repeatedly the problems of institutional lack of candour and promulgated a charter for public authorities to sign to promise to act with integrity and candour. That report was, of course, with respect to a process that took nearly 30 years to achieve a just outcome. Incidentally, whilst most people remember the role of the police at Hillsborough, it's worth remembering that a substantial secondary issue in that disaster concerned the emergency response, both by the police and the ambulance service. The context of Grenfell is, of course, very different, but the parallels are there for all to see. No one sought to criticise the individual police and ambulance staff battling to save lives, but the new inquest jury concluded that the failures promptly to declare a major incident, to establish command and control, to coordinate and communicate, in effect to follow long-established major incident principles, delayed an effective response and contributed to the death toll. The other parallel is that throughout the process, the police and the ambulance service flatly refused to accept that their command and control failures had materially affected the emergency response. Institutional defensiveness that we say is being repeated here by the LFB. In these proceedings, RBKC have signed up to the Bishop's Charter, as indeed has the Mayor, but we're unaware of any other public authority CP having done so, or indeed private corporations promising to act within its spirit. And although RBKC have publicly announced their commitment to the Charter, and indeed discussed adherence to it with us, we make clear that we still await, 18 months down the line, anything approaching a full statement regarding their role in the disaster. We've made clear to them that candour must be demonstrated, not announced. It's not a public relations tool. RBKC, owner, responsible person, responsible for the planning committee, responsible for building control, involved at all levels, and they know many of the legal responsibilities stop with them. They must have a lot to tell us. The bereaved and survivors do not understand the 18-month delay in RBKC coming forward. I could go on referring to other inquiries in the report, but I've made my point. There's a widespread clamour for transparency and candour to be addressed through substantive changes to the law. Parliament has already considered one such bill. There's cross-party support for such change. But in the context of these proceedings, the rules and processes already allow for this problem to be taken on head-on to a significant degree. You've listened to our submissions at the outset of the inquiry, and you've begun to utilise position statements and required Rule 9 statements. In the light of the lack of meaningful responses setting out acknowledged failings, we submit that those requirements must now be ramped up. 18 months down the line, the inquiry, the survivors and bereaved, the community, are all entitled to expect full and unequivocal assistance from institutional and corporate CPs. And now, not in a year's time, or even later than that, with the repeated invocation that this is a matter for phase 2, and that's a matter to be reviewed down the line. One of the imperatives in undertaking a public inquiry is cost and efficiency. The reason some public inquiries and iconic inquests have taken so long isn't because of complicated subject matter. It's because of an inability or unwillingness to confront this endemic lack of institutional or corporate candour. I started by saying that this was a disaster made by human beings. The inquiry has powerful weapons at its disposal to require candour. If it develops them, this process will reach robust conclusions far more swiftly to the benefit of all. Both the public authority and private corporation CPs here have had disclosure of the detailed expert reports. They've had the opportunity of posing questions through CTI to those experts. Although there's more investigation to be done, additional expert opinion to be obtained, none of the public or private institutions and corporations can be in any doubt whatsoever what the issues are that affect them. The issue with which this inquiry, all of us, requires assistance. They should be unequivocally asked to set out what went wrong in the areas of product promotion, design, procurement, fabrication, build, site work, maintenance, management, regulation for which they were responsible or in which they were engaged. As Mr. Friedman made clear this morning, this isn't a process of determining liability, but it does involve getting to the truth, and that includes accountability, and it includes judgmental conclusions. And in approaching the investigation in this way, the inquiry will be able to focus its work far more efficiently. We urge you to address candour in the Phase 1 report, not only with respect to what we say is the institutional defensiveness of the LFB, but also with an eye to the public authorities and corporate CPs who will enter the spotlight more in Phase 2. This is a key issue, and respectfully, it should not be ducked. The LFB, systemic failings. For the rest of my submissions, I'm going to focus on the LFB because that's where the evidence has mainly been. And what we say are the systemic failings that contributed to the disaster. Given the imperative to try and complement rather than repeat submissions, I'm directing my approach to contingency planning and response to emergency calls, evacuation and FSG calls respectively, because they're central to the failures. In its recent 24th of October position statement, where it purports to set out lessons learned, or more precisely, the actions it's taken since the fire, and today in oral submissions, LFB says it's an organisation committed to improvement and learning. It asserts that its review team has 30 dedicated staff. There are some sensible nods which we applaud to practical changes, such as the rolling out of smoke hoods, and consideration of the greater use of drones, smoke curtains, for example. But other than fleetingly, LFB failed to address the two central issues we focused upon, and to which I'm going to turn. The lack of contingency planning for when Stayport breaks down, or in the language of the national guidance I'm going to turn to in a minute, became, quote, untenable. And the fact that the FSG process was not fit for purpose for a significant incident with more than a handful of FSGs, and critically, that this was a fact that was known to LFB before the fire. Why are these central issues notable really by their absence from the position statement of the LFB? Of course, they refer to reviews to their policies 633 and 790, high-rise firefighting and FSG policies respectively. But if they're included in those reviews, why are these issues not expressly highlighted and taken on head-on? Because they're obvious, and they've been repeatedly referred to by us on behalf of the bereaved and the survivors, and taken up in questions by your council. And let there be no misunderstanding. I mean that had there been proper contingency planning in place, had it not adhered to an obviously failed stay put and rescue plan, rather than a plan B, evacuation, then outcomes would doubtless have been different. Many more lives would have been saved. In the written closing, LFB has a whole section headed evacuation. And paragraph 85 makes the following assertion, quote, while it's still the brigade's position that the statutory guidance makes no provision within the type of building design used in Grenfell for anything other than a stay-put strategy, the brigade is considering amendments to these policy notes to provide additional guidance to crews, officers and control room operators. That said, the brigade wishes to emphasise that there is no simple and expedient plan B for implementing a full-scale simultaneous evacuation plan when a catastrophic failure occurs. The perplexing thing about this assertion is that the statutory guidance, of course, relates to the building regulations. The real issue for the fire brigade shouldn't be whether that guidance helps, but whether the national guidance for fire and rescue services on firefighting in high-rise buildings mentions evacuation when stay put breaks down, and unremarkably, it most certainly does. However, not only do the fire brigade fail to mention GRA 3.2 in the section on evacuation, they fail to mention it at all in the whole of their closing submissions. I'm going to come to GRA 3.2 in a moment, but first contingencies more generally. What do we mean by contingencies and contingency planning? It's a general proposition. The stay-put strategy has been effective, as we've heard, in high-rise residences, whereas there's certainly a discussion to be had as to whether stay-put has had its day. It was not unreasonable, as at 14th of June, to have stay-put as a strategy for many high-rise residences, so long as they didn't have dangerous cladding and effective fire safety layers. However, emergency services, by their nature, do not live in the world of the general, the normal and the ordinary. Of course, there are many types of fire that fire brigades will see as a matter of routine: chip pan fires, kitchen fires, fires in bins. But equally, emergency services know that it must deal with the unexpected: the plane or train crash, explosions, suicide bombings, sinkholes, bridges collapsing, natural disasters, extreme weather. All of these require not just default planning, but contingency planning and versatile and rapid imposition of control and command decision-making. Although stay put has been an effective strategy in many high-rise residences, breakdown in compartmentation and large-scale facade fires are hardly unheard of. Lacanau and a host of other disasters and near disasters have been referred to already. Fires both in the UK and internationally. Indeed, in the evidence, we've seen the tall building fires presentation provided by LFB itself. Distinguished, we might add, by its lack of circulation. But it certainly recognised the phenomenon of dangerous high-rise fires and fire spread across facades with new building materials. Of course, we can all distinguish, as has been attempted, between these fires and Grenfell. And of course, the loss of life here was indeed unprecedented in UK terms. But that stay put was not infallible was well known. We don't need the LFB presentation on that, on spectacular high-rise fires, or even Lacanau for that fact. We just need to look at GRA 3.2. GRA 3.2 is national guidance for the fire and rescue services from central government. The generic risk assessments are produced to minimise inconsistencies of approach and outcome across different fire and rescue services and to assist in meeting the requirements of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. That's expressly asserted in the document I'm not sure we've looked at, but it's the GRA introduction document on open source. It introduces the whole series. More than that, page 6 of GRA 3.2 acknowledges that the guidance was issued consequent to a number of improvement notices issued by the Health and Safety Executive to fire and rescue services regarding high-rise firefighting systems, and I emphasise the word, and equipment. Thus, these central government generic risk assessments are key documents underpinning and informing local services and policy. From Assistant Commissioner Rowe's evidence, it's clear that the LFB were key stakeholders in the drafting of GRA 3.2. We've set out in writing in the submissions the key passages from GRA 3.2. Indeed, we noted some of them in opening as well. What GRA 3.2 does is set out the definition and basis for stay put evacuation strategy, for that's what it was, an evacuation strategy, but it makes it completely clear that contingency planning is required. It's axiomatic that emergency services have to expect the unexpected, react to the particular circumstances, and that's why they have tools like the decision-making model, which trains, guides commanders to gather, evaluate, set objectives and tactics, communicate them, continually reassess and re-evaluate. It's equally clear in this context, high-rise residential buildings, that national policy requires actual operational contingency planning in advance and expressly contemplates that there'll be a circumstance where stay put is, quote, untenable, and the fire and rescue service will have to move to actual full or partial evacuation, whether simultaneous or staged. That's expressly set out in this national guidance document. The possibility of stay put becoming untenable was real, contemplated, expressly referred to in guidance, not some fantasy so far from reality that no one could reasonably expected to countenance it, not some spacecraft crashing into the Shard. GRA 3.2's matrix included and itemised the eventualities that in fact materialised on 14th of June, and it provided control measures and mitigation in relation to them. Let me pick up some of the key points. Firstly, page 8, a caution that poor maintenance may mean that fire-engineered solutions might not actually work. At Grenfell, this was the case, although we might add poor compliance to poor maintenance, specifically with relation to the lifts and other installations, fire doors, for example. Secondly, page 9, clear reference to rapid fire and smoke spread, vertically up and down and horizontally, and breach of compartmentation with fire spreading to multiple floors. That's exactly what happened on the night, and that's a factor that we referred to this morning, as if it was something that couldn't have been foreseen. Thirdly, page 10, mention of smokestacking and how this can mislead as to location and size of the fire. Fourthly, pages 16 and 17 of the guidance, both the need to understand the evacuation protocol for the building and also to have an operational evacuation plan as a contingency where Stayport becomes untenable. As clear a reference as could be to the known possibility of the default strategy becoming ineffective. And of course, on the night just such eventuality arose, the Stayport became untenable, compartmentation broke down, but there was no plan B for the likes of Mr. Dowden to operate. Fifthly, page 18, local fire and rescue services required to have effective arrangements to deal with fire safety guidance calls and also to deal with the evacuation of the disabled, mobility challenged, ill, injured residents. FSG arrangements must include consideration of how advice will be re-evaluated in the light of calls and how the information loop between caller control and incident command will be achieved, something I'll return to in a moment. On the night, there are, of course, multiple FSG calls, but as we'll submit later, arrangements were neither effective nor did they lead to any re-evaluation of tactics until far too late. Furthermore, no plan, no policy to assist vulnerable residents to get out, and no firefighter lift by which to do so. And of course, you've heard first-hand evidence from some of those mobility and disabled challenged residents, including my client, Maha Kadir. Sixthly, at page 20, express mention that incident commanders should be trained to identify when evacuation should prevail, where stay put is the default strategy. It's apparent from the evidence that this didn't happen at the London Fire Brigade. 7, page 21, incident commanders should review and change the plan when new information becomes available at the incident or from control. Vital that incident commanders utilise functional commanders to the full. Eighthly, incident commanders must recognise where building design and materials may be impacting on fire spread. Specific mention made of plastic or aluminium window frames and panels. It's apparent no awareness on the night. Ninthly, section 2 of the summary to the guidance document at point 23, reference again made to the evacuation of the building made necessary by reason of Stayport becoming untenable due to unexpected fire spread. And control measures raised, including, quote, utilising other emergency services to aid movement of casualties and the public to safe areas, and relying upon, quote, all means of contacting persons within the building, such as intercom telephones, loud hailers, etc. Interestingly, GRA 3.2 raises just the points that we've looked at in evidence, and to which I'll return, but which are dismissed by the London Fire Brigade. The approach envisaged in GRA 3.2 is classic contingency planning. It contemplates a practical workaround to a default safety strategy which has failed. Contradistinction, LFB's high-rise residential building firefighting policies do not follow through and equip incident commanders to evaluate the necessity for abandoning the stay put policy and invoke any contingency plan to evacuate. Indeed, LFB do not have any contingency planning policy for high-rise residential blocks where there's a breach of compartmentation at all. Policy 633 repeatedly refers to rescue and multiple rescue, and only at paragraph 745 does it refer to the possibility of evacuation. And then only to point at the difficulty of so doing. No contingency plan, no plan B, no guidance on how an incident commander should evaluate abandoning the default position, no guidance on how evacuation might be achieved, what factors would assist, such as immediately informing control so that advice can be changed, and the specific measures referred to in GRA 3.2. As we've heard in evidence, compounding the lack of policy around contingencies, absolutely no training on evacuation from high-rise blocks. In our submission, paragraph 85 of the written closing by LFB is somewhat disingenuous when it states that the statutory guidance makes no reference to evacuation as a required contingency to stay put when it fails. Because the LFB know full well that the national guidance most applicable is GRA 3.2, not least because of the part they played in drafting it. The lack of reference to GRA 3.2 in the submissions speaks volumes. Is this a public authority which is trying to assist the inquiry? Or is this a public authority which is avoiding obvious and serious failings in its systems and in its operations on the night? Yes, there's reference to welcome positive changes and some policy reviews, but nowhere does LFB properly grapple with the key issues. Given that the GRAs are not only national guidance to assist in the saving of life, but they were expressly promulgated to assist fire and rescue services to discharge their duties under health and safety regulations. The failure of LFB to follow through with appropriate policies and training is, in our submission, a clear breach of the general Article 2 duty to have a reasonable policy to minimise the life-threatening risks of a known dangerous scenario. Both G4 and G3 have referred to this in written submissions, and we've footnoted a whole host of authorities regarding that proposition if it's thought to be in any way controversial. We urge you to clearly identify the systemic failures in the interim report. The LFB position, and that of some of its senior officers, is that evacuation was not possible or, quote, virtually impracticable. Essentially, we say that's an attempt to avoid the question. We've heard that the building was, quote, not built for evacuation, no means of communication, conditions deteriorating. Difficult it might have proved, problematic a single staircase and no general alarm might have been, but facing the inferno that the tower rapidly became, there was simply no option. The success of evacuation would have been directly related to how soon it was put into effect and how efficient it was. But can it be really disputed that early evacuation would have saved many lives? We asserted as much in opening. We underline that submission following the evidence. Before I turn to the evidence, I note in passing the recent opinions of Professor Purser supporting the work of Dr. Lane regarding evacuation times. Would it have been possible, and how long would it have taken? Mr. Friedman's referred to the 7-minute point. At another place, in a slightly different context, Professor Purser refers to 15 minutes. We fully understand the difficulties of an evacuation in Grenfell Tower. But the single staircase, the conditions would not have been ideal. But there was no absolute safety issue with simultaneous evacuation. It was not impossible to do. And it would have been unlikely to have impacted or been impacted by the operations of the firefighters. And obviously the firefighters would have played an important role in facilitating the evacuation, particularly of the elderly and the vulnerable. It was a matter of organising it. It's an unattractive position for the LFP to speak of virtual impracticability when that morning they appear to have given it scant consideration and no policy consideration. To the evidence. Stephanie Barwise and Danny Friedman have set out the facts and chronology, and therefore I'm simply going to cherry pick a few times. From 108 objectively, according to the experts, the fire had escaped or was about to escape onto the cladding, objectively. Within a short time, a very short time, any chance of stopping the fire was impossible. From Professor Bisbee's compilation number 1, we can see by observation that the fire is raging out of control, certainly by 1:15. By 1:26, the fire was almost the whole height of the building, from level 4 to level 23, along B5 column, a height of over 50 metres. Compartmentation had been breached on a number of levels, and Dr. Lane, of course, opines that stay put was untenable from at least this point. But the key is when subjectively the incident commanders should have realised that the building was compromised on different levels and the fire was out of control. In our submission, this was not a binary moment. The realisation should have begun to form soon after 1:08, as the fire rapidly spread and as the minutes went by. Incident command should have had well in mind that the fire was reaching a stage where it was not safe for residents to remain, and should have formed a decisive plan which would have commenced a determined evacuation at the very least by 1:26. Every minute thereafter is relevant when we speak of the LFB's institutional failure to get residents to safety. Sure enough, we've heard evidence that with a facade fire it might burn off without re-entering. Given this was a densely populated high-rise residential block, one stairwell, in the height of summer when windows would naturally be open, and the fire rapidly spreading with information available and coming from firefighters inside the building that fire and smoke had spread internally, with calls starting to come in from imperiled residents, the point when it should have been obvious that stay put was no longer tenable must have been very early. If that wasn't 1:15 or thereabouts when the fire was plainly spreading out of control, it was most certainly by 1:26. We reject the suggestion that this is based on hindsight. It should have followed from observation, gathering information from the fireground and from applying the DMM. Gather, assess, re-evaluate, determine objectives, make plans, communicate them, control the activity. If it was obvious to police officers like PC Sanger at 1:28, approaching the tower, who radioed that the police should prepare for evacuation, why was it not obvious to the LFB? Mr. Friedman has alluded to the invidious position Mr. Dowden was in. Within minutes of his arrival, the fire had escalated well beyond that which a watch manager is expected to command. The practical fact that senior officers were not on the ground for some time was not mitigated by remote advice or support, something that was envisaged not only within the mobilising policy 412, but was also something that would have been triggered by an early declaration of a major incident by the LFB through the strategic response arrangements in policy 699, which would have immediately stood up Gold Command and the Commissioner's group. There's scant evidence of any attempt by senior managers to assist before arrival, which meant that a watch manager was left in charge for almost the whole of the golden hour of emergency response opportunity. Indeed, as has been stated, it was not until Mr. Rowe arrived at 2:43 when any proper command and control was established. Why therefore no mention in the LFB closing statements of how they intend to ensure that they never put a watch manager in that position again? Why indeed? Policy, including 424, did provide for a monitoring officer, and although that post was assumed, no support was in fact given by Mr. Walton, who was the monitoring officer designate, until he arrived at the incident ground around 1:50. With rapid escalation directed by Mr. Dowden, a DAC assisted by an AC should have taken over at 10 pumps, but nothing of the kind happened. In the meantime, no effective command and control support, no contingency policy or training. The default strategies of stay put and defend in place were continued in the face of overwhelming evidence that they weren't working. Why? Because, as we've seen, policy and training did not equip the responders to consider or change to a contingency evacuation, because no external command and control support was provided to Mr. Dowden, and because a watch manager was left in charge of a fire that was so far beyond his capability that he didn't want to do. We've set out the facts relating to Mr. Dowden at paragraph 19 of our written submissions, and I don't repeat them here. The two incident commanders following Mr. Dowden, Mr. Walton and Mr. O'Loughlin, fared little better. Until relieved at 2:43, Mr. O'Loughlin indicated that he had no expectation that flats other than on the northeast side would be affected, or that compartmentation had failed. He turned his airwave off as he approached the tower, and he didn't consider he needed details of the FSG calls to formulate a plan. Indeed, shortly before before the position was taken by Mr. Rowe, Mr. O'Loughlin noted his surprise at being told the number of persons reported. It was for the incident commander to change from stay put to evacuation and to determine that FSG callers were to be advised to get out if they could. A further 45 minutes were wasted because Mr. O'Loughlin failed to get situational awareness such that he could have properly evaluate what to do. Of course, other officers, as been mentioned, did have such awareness. Mr. Harrison, Mr. Egan, Mr. Goodall, all of whom on arrival expressed that they thought evacuation would follow. On assuming command, Mr. Rowe took no convincing at all that it was, quote, absolutely unsustainable to continue with stay put. So much for what happened. But what could have happened? Are the LFB correct that evacuation was virtually impracticable? And given the reality that there was really no alternative, had the default position been abandoned by or around 1:26, and its determined evacuation imposed, attention would then have been focused on how to overcome the difficulties of a single staircase and no general alarm and a raging fire, not if. First, the bridgehead would have been informed that all efforts would be made to evacuate. This would have meant that resources would not have been wasted trying to get onto the roof, in moving firefighting media around. Every effort could have been made to maintain the integrity of the stairs. BA crews would have been deployed to systematically clear floors as soon as they'd arrived, using high-rise kit to mark those flats and floors cleared, rather than awaiting debriefs for ad hoc rescues. Secondly, control would have been informed to change advice to callers to get out if you can, and to bang on neighbours' doors if possible. Control could have been asked to ring previous callers back and tell them too, to immediately contact RBKC and the TMO to see whether they could recruit some sensible assistance with lists of vulnerable residents in particular. Thirdly, a firefighter or a police officer could have been stationed on the intercom. I appreciate the problem with falling debris has been raised. But the immediate area, the reality is the immediate area near the entrance had no such falling debris for a considerable period. It was covered by a canopy. It wasn't compromised for a considerable time into the night. From CCTV camera 4, this was certainly after 2:30. From Mr. Bisbee's video number 5, it was probably after 2:40. So plenty of time in our submission to have a person safely stationed at the buzzers. Firefighters or police officers could have been stationed around the block with loudhailers, or, as Mr. Friedman has already mentioned, inside the block too. Despite some assertions to the contrary, there is open source YouTube footage from the night illustrating that a loudhailer at the base of the tower could be heard from the 23rd floor. And we've referred to that in our written submissions of paragraph 35. It indicates that loudhailers could have been effective, at least to some degree. Incidentally, the YouTube clip is apparently picking up the loudhailer used by firefighter Murray, a firefighter that has been read but not called to give evidence, and at a time of 1:40. So in our submission, it was perfectly possible from an early point to use tools such as loudhailers. Furthermore, MPAS evidence about aerial support indicates that helicopters were equipped with PA systems, which could have also been deployed for this purpose. At least such efforts would have alerted residents to the fire before it directly affected them, even if they'd had trouble hearing the particular advice itself. Fifthly, the bridgehead, or a small group of dedicated officers, could have been tasked to identify which floors were clear, who'd been evacuated, and where remaining residents, particularly the vulnerable, might be. Sixthly, a major incident declaration and consequent coordination with the blue light services, the police and ambulance service in particular, could have been deployed to identify who had evacuated but remained from inquiry at the base of the tower, even corralling evacuees to confirm their position and who was left in the tower. And as I noted earlier, the intercom and loudhailer points are specifically mentioned in the national guidance. The statistics show that half of the residents of the tower self-evacuated by 1:42. Dr. Lane reviewed the evidence and indicates that the stairs were largely clear prior to that time. Although there may have been some difficulties passing the hot zone between 13 and 16, between 2 o'clock and 2:30, there were multiple self-evacuations and assisted rescues up to and beyond 4 o'clock, including from above level 16 until around 3:55. Although conditions undoubtedly deteriorated, and at times particular levels became more difficult to pass, evacuation was possible for several hours. What was missing was a coordinated plan, or indeed a plan at all. FSGs. As Incident Command persisted with firefighting and failed to re-evaluate or abandon stay put, a parallel and almost unconnected process dealt with the 999 calls. Without steer from Incident Command, the control room continued blind, with a process based on advice to stay put and providing information to the fireground to facilitate individual rescues. Policies 539 and 790 deal with the handling of 999 calls and FSG calls respectively. As we know, where the building evacuation strategy is stay put, the caller will be told to get out if they become directly affected by fire, or advised to stay put otherwise, underpinned by confidence in compartmentation and the ability to put the fire out. But the FSG policy is to feed information from 999 callers where residents believe they are trapped as well to the fireground to facilitate rescue, whilst advising callers to consider escape routes or otherwise remain safe. So the aims of the policy are to provide the best informed life safety advice on the one hand, and on the other to provide optimum details to the fireground to facilitate rescue. Neither of those aims was achieved on the night, nor was any information loop. On the one hand, resources were being wasted on other efforts, which only exacerbated the problems, whilst many residents who still had a window of opportunity to self-evacuate were being told to stay put. Has stay put been abandoned at or before 1:26? All the callers between then and when the advice actually was changed, sometime after 2:35, would have been advised to get out if they could. From our schedules, the schedules that we provided last week, this translates in our submission to around 57 999 calls relating to 25 different flats. Instead, what happened? Residents were told to stay put because no one had told control room of a change of policy. No one had told them compartmentation had been breached. Inquiries were not consistently made as to whether residents were becoming affected by heat, fire or smoke and whether they could leave. The operation of the process was, on any rational view, hopeless. At control, they operated blind from the Incident Command. Scraps of paper, whiteboards, a mishmash of radio messages, mobile phone and landline were used to communicate with the fireground. The fireground messages were not initially picked up by the Incident Command appliance, and they were diverted to a fire appliance en route. The FSG messages, the first FSG messages, were received at the fireground by the CU8 at around 1:43. But just how they were collated there, assuming they were, remains unclear, and likewise how they were passed on. Mr. Merrick in CU8 gave evidence that he communicated messages on to Mr. Kentfield, and it may be some messages were forwarded directly to the watch manager De Silva by radio. There's scant physical record of what was happening to the information at this time, save for the notes made by Mr. Merrick, apparently, as he received them. We know, and I reference the G3 BA deployment schedule here, that no BA crew was deployed to any flat as a result of a 999 call or the FSG process while Mr. Dowden was incident commander nearly an hour into the fire. The average delay through the night in deploying crews to flats to which crews actually were deployed on our analysis was 1 hour and 10 minutes from the time of the first 999 call. And I stress to flats to which deployments were actually made, because almost half of them, there weren't such deployments. At 2:13, Mr. Sadler apparently started his car bonnet staging post, literally with notes made on the back of an envelope. We timed that because of the picture he took of the envelope, so he could pass it on to the tower. It's not until 2:23, an hour and a half into the fire, that the dedicated CU7 became operational for FSG management, far, far too late. By that point, about 24 of the 33 flats from which FSG calls were made had called 999 at least once. Standing back from all of this, what was happening was efforts being made, best efforts being made, but chaos resulting. Staging posts popping up at car bonnets and the entrance to the tower by Mr. Williams and on the mezzanine. Scraps of paper, backs of envelopes, walls, whiteboards used at these points and at the bridgehead to record information that then had to be moved about. The fact that the FSG process failed should not be a surprise to anybody. It certainly shouldn't have been a surprise to the LFB. We know that from the evidence of Mr. Johnson, who told senior policy officers while he served on the dedicated command unit section, what better place could he have been at Islington in 2014, that policy 790 was not effectively fit for purpose for multi-call incidents, and he demonstrated it through a training package. But regrettably, his criticisms and proposals for change were not heeded. Babcock declined to take the training forward. The package demonstrated that it would be impossible to pass information on within the timescales of what was felt to be a realistic progression of a high-rise incident. In effect, the training package showed that it was impossible to meet reasonable timescales, and of course that was proved by the incident itself. Where there's one or a small number of calls, the control room will liaise with the incident command appliance, and no doubt the incident commander direct and remain on the line. At a multi-call incident, the dedicated unit to deal with calls will have to get to the incident, will have to set up. Communication will have to be established between the commander, the bridgehead, the command unit, control. The policy requires a loop where information comes from the caller to the incident ground. It's acted upon and a debrief goes back. As we've seen from the evidence, the FSG process on the incident ground was shambolic. It took nearly 20 minutes from the first FSG calls for them to be notified to the incident ground. No information was ever fed back to the control room. If, as policy intended, the IC was reliably kept informed as a pivot point within the loop of information, this in turn would have brought earlier and clearer focus upon the need to abandon Stayport. But in reality, the incident commanders remained quite independent of the process, at least until Mr. Rowe took over, far too late. Our analysis of the evidence up to 4:15, in the schedules, again, which we provided to the inquiry team last week, we indicate that only 3 deployments of firefighters resulting directly from FSG calls led to fully successful outcomes, with another 2 which were partially successful. Out of 33 flats from which 999 calls were made, no rescue deployments at all were made in almost half of them. Of course, in some of those cases, residents eventually self-evacuated, and some met and were assisted by firefighters in lobbies and on the stairway. The point made is that the FSG process on the night was successful in only a handful of cases. The fact that firefighters assisted residents in lobbies and on the stairs supports the proposition that deployment to search and clear floors would have been far more effective. Neither does there seem to have been any correlation between calls which were noted as priorities in CU7 on the grid that you may recall, where the LFB had information that trapped residents were elderly or children, immobile or ill, and the deployments. Among the 16 999 calls where there were apparently no deployments at all, 11 were noted as priorities on the grid. Finally, in terms of the statistics, we note that 22 emergency calls had been received from 15 flats where the caller identified the flat number by 145. 21 of those were passed to the fairground as FSG calls. The significance of that is By 1:25, all 999 calls identifying particular flats were being passed on to the fireground, and by 1:45, there were a huge number of them. The fire was out of control, the control room was overrun, the FSG policy was not producing results, and that continued through the incident. There was a disconnect between command and the control room. Critically, information flow was one way from control to the fireground. Much of the information out of date by the time we got to the bridgehead, or because of a lack of feedback from the tower. So some information fell between the cracks and was not passed on despite callers being told that rescue was on its way. Incident command failed to appreciate the volume of calls. I'm conscious of time, but I would like to finally move on to an example, and that's the example of flat 142 on level 17. Just how unfit for purpose the FSG policy was is illustrated by reference to flat 142. As I've stated from Mr. Johnson's evidence, we know LFB were aware of how it wouldn't cope with multiple calls. Whether it's possible to have a workable FSG process to deal with multiple calls remains in question, but its known deficiencies should have underlined the need for a general evacuation. The residents of flat 142 were the family of my client Mohammed Hakim. You may not be immediately familiar with 142, as there's been so little evidence about it. It'll feature in the next phase when we deal with what happened to each deceased, because the 5 members of the family in the flat perished in the fire. But I'm not referring to 142 now for that purpose, but to illustrate how information fell between the cracks. There were 3 999 calls from flat 142. At 1:29, reporting smoke coming into the flat. At 2:27, reporting by then the fire was right next to the window. And at 3:18. I just want to spend a moment tracing the evidence that we know about that. The first call was actually taken by the police at 1:29, and they passed it on to the fire brigade at 1:38. Control passed the information to the fireground as an FSG by radio, but the incident command appliance didn't respond, and the information had to be intercepted by CU8 in the process of setting up at 1:43. There doesn't appear to have been any system, as I've said, at CU8, certainly at that point. But at some time before 2:17, the legend 17th floor 142 FSG did appear on the second floor bridgehead wall. We can be clear about that extent of time because that's when the bridgehead was moved to the 3rd floor. So it's a reasonable conclusion that somehow the information had gone from control to CU8 to the bridgehead before that time. There's no evidence that the flat 142 information passed through Mr. Sadler's car bonnet staging post or indeed Mr. Williams's post at the entrance to the tower. There's no evidence at all that the information went from the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor when the bridgehead moved, and it appears that the information passed on from this first call was lost. So had been the best chance of rescuing the family. When no one came, the family made a second call almost an hour later at 2:27. At 2:30, the control room officer who took the call passed the information to CU7. Mr. Peckham noted the radio transmission on a control information form, so we know that was received. We know it was added to the laminated board in CU7. There's no evidence, however, that that second call was communicated to the tower until much later on, when Mr. Fennell took a photograph of the laminated board to the tower sometime after 3:15. Again, the family waited, and no one came. At 3:18, the family made the third call, spoke to the same CRO. A control information form again was generated at 3:23, so we know the information was passed on. CU7 were also informed independently by the police, PC Jacobs, that 5 people were trapped in flat 142 just after this time at 3:35. That too was recorded on a CIF. This information did appear to go to the tower because it ended up on the bridgehead on the ground floor. But by the time of this third 999 call, it was too late because the last crew to successfully reach level 17 had been deployed there somewhat earlier. Despite 3 999 calls, information being passed to CU8, twice to CU7, independent police information going to CU7, no rescue crew was ever deployed to flat 142, lost between the cracks. Conclusions. Long before the firefighters could have been deployed onto the fire in flat 16, it had escaped onto the cladding. From a very early stage, it was obvious that no means of firefighting was going to extinguish or slow the progress of the fire. The fire brigade failed to react appropriately because of a series of systemic errors. We urged the inquiry not to confuse effort with outcome. Very brave attempts were being made to save lives, but commanders were following the wrong plan with policies that were plainly not fit for purpose. 633, no mention of the possibility of the need to evacuate where stay put was the default policy. Mention made of the possibility of the need to evacuate, but no contingency or operational plan for how that could be approached. This compounded by the complete absence of training. Given the scale of the disaster, it's apparent that the FSG system never got off the ground, at no stage worked efficiently, and was ineffective in saving lives. In fact, in adhering to a plan that was plainly inappropriate from the outset, the FSG process hindered rather than helped. The LFB are right to highlight the courage of individual firefighters, but they do them a disservice when they fail to acknowledge the obvious systemic errors which place those firefighters as well as residents at greater risk to life and limb. Those systemic failures are all the more serious because LFB had been involved in drafting the national guidance. It knew post-Lacanau the policy fix with the FSG policy simply didn't work for an incident with more than a handful of trapped persons. We urge you to carefully consider the following findings. Firstly, that there was a systemic failure to have any contingency plan to safeguard life, where a stay-put strategy became untenable, or training to evaluate or operate such a plan. Secondly, that there was a systemic failure to properly gather, collate, make available sufficient information concerning the Grenfell Tower to allow for such contingency planning and operation. Thirdly, that those systemic failures led to the failure to take decisive action to safeguard life by evacuating the tower from about 126. And lastly, that the FSG policy 790 was known to be unfit for purpose prior to the fire and indeed failed on the night. Those are our submissions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That might be a convenient point, I think, to have a 10-minute break. Give the transcribers' fingers a rest. So we'll break now and come back, start again at 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, Mr. Stein, your turn to make a statement. Before you start, can I just say that we're probably starting at an hour which you hadn't originally expected to start at. I don't want you to feel rushed. It would be probably good for us and good for you to hear the whole of your statement at once. But if we get to a time when you feel it's not going to work, you tell me.
Sir, I understand that. I've already spoken to our stenographer about the need to keep to a reasonable pace as well, so I'll bear those matters in mind.
Yeah. All right, we'll see how we go, shall we?
So, the London Fire Brigade let down the firefighters who attended the Grenfell Tower fire, as well as the residents of the Grenfell Tower. Quite simply, the LFB was not able to take on a fire of this magnitude as it had had insufficient training, inadequate equipment, and no leadership capable of tackling this fire. The London Fire Brigade was a disorganised organisation. The evidence before this inquiry has demonstrated that the London Fire Brigade has a cultural inability to plan for a major disaster in any high-rise block, whether residential or office or any large building. It has completely failed to train or test equipment, such as radio and other communication systems, under true-to-life conditions. The majority of the equipment which is meant to allow the London Fire Brigade to communicate, analyse and assess a fireground did not work. And the London Fire Brigade has demonstrated an inability to be able to grasp and learn from mistakes. Instead, what we have from the Commissioner at the end of her evidence on the 27th of September of this year is the much quoted comment that she would not change anything we did on the night. The Commissioner, Danny Cotton, should have been well aware of the dreadful failings within the Fire Brigade, which had been identified before this inquiry by the time she came to give her evidence. We suggest that there has been a failure to consider the unfolding evidence before this inquiry by both the Commissioner and her leadership team. We suggest that they are not fit to run the London Fire Brigade. This condemnation of the leadership of the Fire Brigade for London should not be taken to be an insult to those on the front line. No one can or should forget the sheer bravery and determination of the individual firefighters who risked their lives within the Grenfell Tower. I refer to quotes now from two of those brave firefighters. Crew manager Christopher Secret. In his evidence, he referred to the struggle to get out of the bin store. He was hot, disorientated, and stressed. Eventually, we got out and got to a stairwell. The smoke was thick in the stairwell, and he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. We had all lost our energy. We struggled to get down the stairs, and it was a mixture of stumbling, falling, and crawling, trying to get down. After coming down 3 or 4 floors, I realized we had lost firefighter Chris Dorgu. I asked firefighter Bardillo to shout for firefighter Dorgu because I had no energy to do it. Neither did he. We sat there. I looked at my gauge and I saw I only had 15 bar left. I was in big trouble. I put myself in a corner of the stairwell because I did not want to be in anyone else's way if I didn't make it out. In fact, firefighter Dorgu appeared, grabbed his arm, and was able to help him out. Let's not forget the evidence from watch manager Louisa De Silva. Now, we'll recall that she was deployed at the bridgehead. faced there with the job of making sure that firefighters going correctly into the tower. A question was asked of her by counsel to the inquiry, referred to two West Hampstead BA wearers, Martin Hoare and Matthew Tanner, being deployed at roughly 2:55. She was asked what her recollection was about that particular deployment. She said this: "What I remember about that is I recognised them, like I say, because of my time," she had referred to at Kentish Town. So they were firefighters who were familiar to me. What I do remember is firefighter Tanner asking me if there would be water there when he gets there. Any firefighter going near or into a fire will take water. That is a baseline for our safety. And I remember him asking, I remember having to say that it was unlikely there would be any water for him to take with him into those conditions. She went on, "These are firefighters who have seen the building they're entering. I remember having to say to him that it was unlikely there would be water, but yet he was to try and effect rescues." Mr. Silver was sending firefighters into an inferno, and she and they knew it. But this inquiry needs to avoid the mistake being made by the London Fire Brigade, which is to confuse bravery with adequacy of response. Bravery cannot replace training, and bravery is no substitute for equipment. Nor should any of us forget the astonishing courage of the residents of the tower, both those who made it out and those who died in the fire. In the last part of the evidence read before this inquiry on the 3rd of December, the words of Mrs. Emanuela de Saro and the mother of Gloria Trevisan, who lost her life alongside her boyfriend Marco Gottardi and two others in flat 2 on 202 on the 23rd floor, should be remembered. Gloria said to her mother, "You could tell she was having problems talking. Her throat was burning. She was starting to feel unwell and she wanted to go quicker. At a certain point, she told me the fire was coming through the window." A moment later, she said, "She couldn't breathe. She told me again what she felt for us and that we have to say goodbye and we had to be strong." At that point, Gloria said she was cutting off the phone because she didn't want me to hear anything, and she said goodbye to us. Firefighters and residents have no doubt about the bonds that have been made amongst themselves. They know what they saw, what they witnessed, and they have built up strong relationships of friendship and respect. That is why, when the resident and survivors march on the 14th of a month, the firefighters line the march and they meet and greet each other with dignity, warmth, and respect. But there are difficulties for residents and family members from the tower. Residents and family members from the tower and survivors from this fire, even when they don't always believe that individual firefighters either did their best or have even given their evidence honestly because of the dire peril everyone was in, they thank firefighters for the saving of lives. An example of this is Sean Talabi. He said, "I'd like to speak about the fire brigade if I can. No one should ever have to go to work and not return back to their family, no one. Whether you're fire brigade, whether you're a firefighter, whatever job you do. But at the end of the day, it'll be easier sometimes if you just say the truth, because that way people will forgive you. It will be easier for people to forgive you." He went on to say you shouldn't lie on residents that are going through enough as it is and say that you did rescue missions that you didn't do. And of this position, which is difficult for Mr. Talabi, we suggest, he says, "I would like to thank Peter Herrera, the firefighter, for opening the door, because if he didn't open that door, I probably would have gone through the window and I probably would have died." But at the same time, Mr. Herrera made loads of mistakes that night. And all he in fact had to say was, "I tried my best, but I was scared." Where we suggest that the London Fire Brigade has failed as an organisation from a starting point is in failing to assess the potential for risk, in planning to deal with the risk, and therefore in failing to train or equip to cope with such risks. The London Fire Brigade is assisted and sets out by the London Safety Plan, which was approved and is yet unamended on the 30th of March 2017. And it refers to the question of risk management, setting out matters in this way. What does London Fire Brigade mean by risk? It asks, and it answers its own question. The London Fire Brigade's understanding of risk is based on the likelihood of an incident occurring and its consequences. Well, the most likely incidents that may occur may be a fire in a house, a flood, a fire that does not breach compartmentation. And if you base your planning upon such level of risk, you'll never have adequate resources capable and able of helping people in such a fire at the Grenfell Tower. On the 27th of September of this year, Mr. Millett, Queen's Counsel to the inquiry, asked Commissioner Cotton whether there had been a structural or cultural failure by the LFB to respond to new hazards. The response from the Commissioner was to deny that there had been such a failure. During the course of the Commissioner's evidence, she stated that training about fires on building facades would not have helped. And I quote, she said, "I truly don't think it would have benefited anyone to have more detailed knowledge about cladding to respond to the fire at Grenfell, because it wouldn't have enabled them to extinguish the fire," she said. We suggest that it is imperative for the safety of Londoners that the LFB review their management of risk. The consequences of not planning within an emergency service to deal with a known risk is precisely why the London Fire Brigade was outclassed by the Grenfell Tower fire. Without making sure that the London Fire Brigade has the resilience and resources to cope with a major disaster, multiple FSG calls, and a high population risk, then we await the next disaster, which will yet again lead to casualties and death without an adequate response from the LFB. But the truth from other submissions made today and from the background history from other fires is that far from the Grenfell Tower being an unrealistic scenario, the risk of a cladding fire was well known to the LFB. In 1999, after the Garnet Cork fire in Irvine, the Environment, Transport and Regional Affairs Committee examined the potential risk of fire spreading in buildings via external cladding systems. This is 1999. The Fire Brigade Union, in their submissions, observed that there are a number of risks posed by the use of combustible or badly installed external cladding systems, and went on to make further submissions that the primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that it provides a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outer face of the building, with the strong possibility of the fire re-entering the building at higher levels via windows or other unprotected areas in the face of the building. This is, in turn, a threat to the life safety of the residents above the fire floor. 1999. In her evidence, Commissioner Cotton was asked, this is on the 27th of September, whether she had been shown the LFB slideshow titled Tall Building Facades. Her answer was no, despite her background being the Director of Safety and Assurance at the time. Whilst the circulation list contained her senior fire safety officers, she did not know if any had actually seen the presentation. She accepted eventually that the conclusions from the slideshow demonstrated that there had been an emerging consciousness within the LFB that facades of high-risk buildings created risks of fire spread. Now, the key question is whether and how that information had been disseminated to frontline operational firefighters. Well, we know repeatedly from the questions asked by counsel to the inquiry that the answer from the frontline firefighters is they had no knowledge other than one or two who referred to it as having seen it themselves online or on television. The Commissioner's response to the document in relation to whether the information had been given out to the operational firefighters, she said this: "I don't think it has been because I wasn't familiar with this document beforehand. But the normal procedure would be if there was deemed to be something that was a risk that needed to be shared. It would be developed into a training package that could be shared more widely." Asked after she knew why such a training package had not been undertaken. No, I don't. Asked why the presentation was only provided to a limited number of specialists and not been seen. No idea. It was suggested by counsel to inquiry that her evidence indicated both structural and cultural failings within the LFB, a failure to more widely disseminate key elements of fire safety. And her response? Nobody would expect an incident like Grenfell, where the building would fail so spectacularly and be covered in such a highly flammable product, and would be allowed to exist. Whilst ultimately accepting that the Grenfell Tower fire was not a negligible risk and that the risks of such a fire had been on the London Fire Brigade's radar for at least 9 months, the Commissioner argued that training would make no difference. And of course, we have the memorable part of the evidence from the Commissioner addressing the unrealistic scenario that had unfolded at Grenfell Tower, as she put it, where she explained, "I wouldn't develop a training package for a space shuttle to land in front of the Shard. And if we respond to it and deal with it in the same matter we do an incident of that scale, I wouldn't expect us to be developing training or a response to something that simply shouldn't happen." But does not the Commissioner understand that aeroplanes fly into towers, concerts in large buildings are bombed, and towers are vulnerable to fire? But in her evidence, we also learnt one further thing about the tall building facades document. She explained that the only reason she had looked at the tall building facades presentation is that she was going to be questioned before this inquiry. Asked by counsel to the inquiry, "Have you studied this document since Grenfell?" "The tall building facades one," the Commissioner asked. "Yes." "I've looked through it, yes. I've not studied it in detail. I've looked through it." "Who asked you to do that?" counsel to the inquiry asked. Well, the answer from the Commissioner was, "Once you've shown it here in this inquiry, my natural curiosity led me to go and look at it." Natural curiosity. Forgive me if this seems judgmental, Commissioner, but does this seem the right way for the London Fire Brigade Commissioner to be reviewing documents about cladding fire risk? Or is there something we are missing? We have the largest ever civil disaster since World War II, the largest call out of firefighters and appliances that anyone, it seems, has ever heard about. And we have the deaths of 72 people from the vertical community that was the Grenfell Tower building. But when does the Commissioner decide to look at documents that relate to high-rise blocks and cladding fires? Well, it seems only when it is shown before this inquiry. And we ask this question: why did the Commissioner not say within hours, if not days, of the Grenfell Tower fire, "And I want to see everything the LFB has on high-rise block fires and cladding fires? Why did she not say, give me every piece of academic research on cladding fires and let me understand what happened and see how we can improve? The fact is that the Commissioner for the LFB did not ask for this material immediately. The fact is that that defies belief. Why is the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade not taking the lead in examining what happened and why? But it's worse than that, because it also tells us that her senior management team did not brief her, on what was available in the months leading up to the inquiry. London has approximately 1,600 high-rise blocks, both residential and office. The London Fire Brigade has not trained to fight a compartment breaching fire in any of these blocks. This cultural blindness to risk means that the very organisation which we rely upon and pay for, which we all believed before the Grenfell Tower fire was in the business of disaster management and solution, is quite incapable of dealing with a fireground of this complexity. This is like the Army and Navy saying we're pretty good at dealing with a minor skirmish, but we have no plan and we've given no thought to fighting a battle. Because of the abject failure by the LFB to plan for this known risk, no one single person was capable, it seems, of appreciating the growth of this disaster. Mr. Weatherby has examined the GRA 2014 and its contents, and I only say this: it is clear that the London Fire Brigade has failed to comply with its duty under GRA 2014. Therefore, without such planning, the firefighters were left with inadequate equipment and no overall ability to make an assessment of all of the information available from FSG calls, 999 calls, from people at the scene, CCTV photographs or other images sent down drone, helicopter, television, airwave, mobile phone, or the handheld radios. Nor was there the equipment available which might have supported communications, such as the vector computer-based simulation system described by S.M. Johnson as not working for 9 years, or the other not working or useless equipment, such as the Striker camera, tough books, mesh nodes, and CSS. The FSG call centres were blind to the events at the fireground, and the command units didn't have reports from the firefighters within the block and no way to bring together an assessment of the FSG information. So no wonder we have the discrepancy in time and the communication of the abandonment of stay put. Because there were no information feeds and no real communications, we in fact have two separate determinations that the stay put policy should be changed to an evacuation. On the 26th of September, in the questions asked by counsel to the inquiry of AC Andy Rowe, he was asked about his decision to abandon stay put, and two important pieces of information arose. First, Mr. Rowe's ignorance as to Watch Manager Johnson's pilot exercise, which had demonstrated the operational difficulties which arose once fire survival guidance calls numbers rose above 7. Second, that whilst Mr. Rowe had abandoned the stay put policy as of 2:47, in fact, by 2:35, Joe Smith, within one of the FSG centres, was advising that callers evacuate, get out. This could be the last chance. Now, how is it that we have a situation where the call centre assessment, without sight of the tower on fire, is that stay put has to be abandoned, yet that this has not managed to communicate itself to Mr. O'Loughlin, who had been in charge at that time, and therefore not onwards to Mr. Rowe? wouldn't lives have been saved if someone in a command position to make the call to abandon stay put could have had an understanding of the volume and factual content of the FSG calls, as well as effective communications with firefighters in the tower, plus sight of the tower? Marcio Gomez put it this way: the decisions, or better yet, the lack of decisions at the time, cost lives. And I truly believe that a lot more lives would have been saved if things were done quicker. It becomes obvious that where a 21st century emergency service is reliant on runners with pieces of paper, that this is fit only to just about, on occasions, convey emergency rescue information. But as regards the equally important need to use that information to assess the situation, it is simply not fit for purpose. I'm going to move on to the radios and the problems with those at the tower. The handheld radios used by the firefighters at the Grenfell Tower fire operated on a most powerful signal gets through line of sight principle, which means that a standard high-rise building with an inevitable iron steel structure, reinforced concrete components, will block radio waves attempted by communication to be made up and down the tower. The limitations of that equipment used resulted in very significant failings on the night. You will recall the evidence of firefighter O'Byrne, one of the first firefighters to arrive. Mr. O'Byrne witnessed flats on fire, 1 and 2 levels above the fire. He spoke to individuals coming from flats. And he also noted heavy smoke logging in flats on the 6th floor. And he attempted to radio Mr. Dowden using his handheld radio, and he heard nothing back. He said this: I radioed down to Mr. Dowden using my handheld radio and said something along the lines of, the flat above the fire floor is on fire. Their kitchen is alight. We need a BA crew and breaking in gear. I only radioed once. I don't remember hearing any other radio traffic at that time. I didn't get a reply, but I believed my message had been transmitted and that I had spoken clearly. Again, once on the 6th floor, I radioed down to the governor, Mr. Dowden, again, but I didn't get any reply. I didn't get a reply to any of the radio messages I sent to the governor, but I assumed he was still very busy, but that he could still hear me. But was this vital evidence from Mr. O'Byrne, who was the individual that had decided that it would be a good idea to go up the stairs of the tower and see how matters were progressing? Was that vital information received and acted upon or understood at these early stages? Mr. Dowden's evidence in this regard was given on the 27th of June of this year. And he said that he received no information from Mr. O'Byrne as to what Mr. O'Byrne was discovering concerning the conditions on the floors above the 4th floor. The evidence from Mr. O'Byrne and Mr. Dowden is entirely compatible. Mr. O'Byrne recalls trying to transmit the messages but received no acknowledgement or reply. Mr. Dowden does not recall getting these messages, and given that we know where he was standing, which was close to the base of the tower, it is likely that he simply didn't receive the radio traffic, as the tower structure itself would have been blocking the radio transmission. If these calls had been made by a mobile phone, as was demonstrated by the harrowing long call, yet another testament to courage and bravery by Marcio Gomez, as he spoke to Miss Fox at the call centre, then in all likelihood, the call and information to Mr. Dowden would have got through. Now, the ability to use a mobile telephone in fire conditions, without question, is difficult, and it requires an individual phone call to be made. The point is, that type of technology will allow a call to be made in and out of a tower. It may be that you can't just or should not rely upon your personal mobile phones, but that technology is there. Perhaps it's obvious that communications are vital, but let's remind ourselves of some more of the evidence. Miss De Silva at the bridgehead. The sheer volume of FSG calls coming in meant I was receiving information by small pieces of paper, runners, and also by radio with just the floors and flat numbers. The volume of FSG calls were very high. She went on to say, another problem was the BA crews normally use channel 6 to communicate with entry control. However, this channel was proving difficult throughout the incident. There was so much feedback on the channel that it was difficult to use. Someone tried to lay a repeater on the ground floor bridgehead, which is a kind of booster to help with the signal, but that didn't help at all. I've never experienced communication problems on that scale before. And she went on. The BA channel wasn't working well. And so what was the effect of that? She said, crews couldn't tell me what they had or hadn't done through that means either. Some were committed to a specific FSG, but before they got there, they came across casualties who they needed to help there and then. In her evidence, on the 25th of July, again asked about communications. So for a lot of the time, we're unable to get any communications from them at all. That's the firefighters, which is worrying in terms of safety because we want to monitor their air. We want to know their location. If they get into trouble, we need to know where to send an emergency crew as well as where they are firefighting, where they think they are, where they are finding casualties, what rescues are taking place. We are not able to get any of that information back either. Firefighter Morrison, Amanda Morrison, she put it this way. For me, the comms is a massive issue as a game changer for that job. Not having comms is a bit like being disabled in the job. You can't talk to each other. You can't tell each other what you need. You're trying to grab people's helmets and talk to each other through our sets. You can't talk to downstairs to see if they've got anyone coming up, whether they've got any news on us getting water. Firefighter Foster, Katie Foster. I attempted to use my radio to pass on the information that we had found, and especially as there were residents inside. In fact, she and a colleague come across a male who had told us that there were 5 people inside a flat. She remembered trying to radio through around 7 times but was unsuccessful. Greg, the partner she was with, also tried but was also unsuccessful. Now all of this evidence was given before the Commissioner gave her evidence. Did they not have someone within the London Fire Brigade that might have been tasked with listening to what was being said before this inquiry? How can the Commissioner say that she wouldn't have changed a thing? Floor 14, we suggest, is a demonstration of these communications problems leading to loss of life. The inability of firefighters to communicate within the tower, both amongst themselves and with the bridgehead, led, amongst other things, to the tragic failure to rescue occupants of flat 113. Omar Al-Hajj Ali, Dennis Murphy, Zainab Dean and Jeremiah Dean. Firefighters Cornelius, Marion, Murphy and Saunders were the first crew to visit floor 14. They were unable to notify anyone by radio as to the number of residents in flat 113 and the need for additional crews to rescue them with secondary BA kits. It was only on return to the bridgehead that firefighter Cornelius was able to convey that information. Back at the bridgehead, I informed him we needed more BA set wearers and more people to go up there and rescue the 8 people. He added, I tried constantly to contact the bridgehead, anyone downstairs, telling them we needed second sets and what we had found, and that we weren't going to be able to bring the people down the stairs. And that was on both of his radios. Firefighter Murphy tried as well. But at that point, at no point did we hear anything. We didn't hear any chatter over the radios at all. We tried again. There was no radio communications with the Barry sets or with our handhelds, says Firefighter Cornelius. Firefighters Herrera and Firefighter Orchard ultimately effected a rescue of only 4 of the 8 residents from flat 113. Firefighter Herrera recollects being tasked to rescue 3 people. Firefighter Orchard to rescue 6. Firefighter Herrera said he was tasked to look for a family, an adult male, female and child. Firefighter Orchard, she called us forward and told us that there are, I think, she said 6 people in flat 113 on level 14. She said they're all right, but they're not all right now. We need to get them out. Now, we know that Firefighter Herrera contends that both he was told, this is his evidence, by Omar al-Harjali, that there were no more occupants in the flat, and that whilst he conversed with Mr. Ali in the lounge of flat 113, he, Mr. Herrera, states he was not aware of the residents in the first bedroom. The credibility of those assertions are strongly challenged, and the chair is invited to determine this matter. Notwithstanding those issues, it is plain that the inability of firefighters Herrera and Orchard to communicate with the bridgehead denied them the opportunity to confirm the expected numbers of persons in the flat. Firefighter Cornelius asked the question, one question that's arisen is, what difference would radio contact have made for you at that stage? For me, it was a big factor. It would have given me confidence in what I was telling the people, that we could send another crew of firefighters up, or more crews, multiple crews with second sets. That, to me, would have been a key element in saving them. The Fire Officers Association submission set out by Mr. Brown, Queen's Counsel, and Mr. Wall, dated the 6th of December 2018, understandably observe at paragraph 103 that communication problems were one of the factors impacting upon ability to undertake an evacuation, since it meant that crews could not communicate how many BA were required for a particular floor. Well, we suggest that's right, but an understatement of the position. Since the fire, where have we got to? The absence of substantive change following these incidents gives rise to concerns that the same will happen post-Grenfell. And has the communication equipment failure been addressed since the fire? Sadly, we suggest that the LFB's response has been piecemeal at best. So you'll have noted our submissions in this regard at pages 24 and 25 of the written submissions. The London Fire Brigade's 24th of October 2018 updated position statement, in other words, updating what they've done since the fire, titled Actions Since the Grenfell Tower document, made reference to some steps to address some of the communication issues identified. Reference made to the, as an example, the introduction of improved Barry equipment to be undertaken, there referred to, but not until 2020 or 21. Also referring to the command unit replacement project, acknowledging the ongoing issues regarding the reliability of the CSS is still over 2 years from completion. Now, of course, such steps as those are welcome, but notable omissions include the failure to address the following. A, the problems of communicating using the existing handheld radio system within a concrete, steel and glass building and at incidents where there is a significant volume of radio traffic. B, the apparent lack of effectiveness of the repeater and or leaky feeder equipment. C, the need for realistic training to overcome communications in what are known to be challenging circumstances. D, the failure to instruct an expert in the field of communications to overcome problematic communication within buildings and built environments. E, the need for funding and policy change to enable the deployment of airwave fire link radios directly on the fire ground. This piecemeal approach, undertaken at a glacial pace, is typified by the fact that the London Fire Brigade's written closing submissions simply state that the brigade is aware of a range of incident communication challenges, both in relation to the fire ground radio and the breathing apparatus equipment and capacity that occurred at Grenfell Tower. Going on to say, in respect to the brigade's fire ground and BA radio equipment provision, both systems are scheduled for replacement in the financial year 2019-20. Moving on, the LFB there sets out the lessons learned and experienced from the Grenfell Tower fire will be considered as part of the development of the technical specification for these replacement radio projects. So instead of setting out in detail for this inquiry what the LFB has done and proposes, we are left to look through their announcements. The London Fire Brigade document titled Replacement of Incident Ground Communications Update, dated the 21st of May 2018, sets out, in frankly a confused document, a decision that has been named to consider the purchase of radio sets. And it looks like the purchase is from a company called Intel, the cost assessment being 1.6 million. But if that is what the London Fire Brigade is setting itself out as needing to do, as we understand it, the problem is that such radios from Intel will be simplex only. Simplex meaning that only one person can talk at a time. This means that even if a firefighter is communicating a relatively routine message, so long as this is more powerful, this will block the communication from another firefighter on the same channel or cut out that call. The person with the strongest signal will generally be the person closest to the receiver radio or with the least obstructions. And radios of this type are also low-powered, and therefore signals will be easily obstructed by reinforced concrete. So we doubt whether the LFB is on the right track. As these types of handheld radios will not penetrate a building such as the Grenfell Tower itself, the issue is not just whether there was too much radio traffic, but whether communications can be established up and down a building. We know a radio that is contained within a mobile telephone, as demonstrated by Marcia Gomez, will call up and down a tower. And that is because it is transmitting a signal outside of the tower to a cell site mast and then back to a recipient. A simple radio can transmit to an outside signal repeater and then back into the building, as long as they are line of sight one to another. The New York system could be adopted, which allows for a hard-wired, it's called an ARC system, which could be installed in high-rise buildings that allows their interfloor communications. The London Fire Brigade and this inquiry need to have the assistance of a communications expert to advise us what the best solution is to these types of communications issues within a fire ground in a large building. In summary, the ability to communicate, receive and process information within the London Fire Brigade structure was appalling. The firefighters' response to the fire and overall attitude was a commendable keep going regardless, but it was undermined by the inability to pass communications from firefighter to firefighter and firefighters to decision makers. The reaction from the London Fire Brigade has been far too slow, and we suggest that the LFB's leadership remains incapable of making decisions that adequately react to the dangers faced by the people under its care. Sir, if I may, I would suggest I have another 10 minutes.
Yeah, you keep going, if you're content.
I am. So let me move on to then the views of people from the tower regarding equipment failures, because some have addressed this. Rosemary Oyawole, 15th of October. She says, I would like to say that we lost beautiful, beautiful people that night, innocent children. Everyone that passed away that night was innocent, and nobody deserved that. If events might have played out differently, then I probably wouldn't be sitting here today myself. So I just think the people that came back that night, or the firemen that came back that night, they were, on many occasions people came back. People had the chance to see how many people were brought into our flat. People had the chance to see the state of the people that were brought into our flat. And for there not to be any precautions taken into place and, the right equipment being given to people to come and get people out of our flat, I think if they did have the correct equipment, then I personally think that the people that passed away in our flat possibly wouldn't have passed away. And that's all I'd like to say. Helen Gamaskel, 6th November. We've seen failings and failings. I've been failed so many times, Failings and failings and failings with other fires and other lessons not learnt. So Grenfell has to stand for something, and it's to stop here about how people are treated and how the loopholes in the system need to be closed, Justice for me is that, this never happens again, We have a fair system. We have a lot to deal with, especially in this environment at the moment. But it has to stop here. The London Fire Brigade needs a shake-up from the top down. The Grenfell Tower fire marks a point in history where the brigade should have said, we need to change. We need to review our resources to be able to undertake realistic planning for what were known risks to high-rise towers from cladding fires. We do not see that the Commissioner or her office have recognised this need to change. Within days, if not weeks of this fire, the London Fire Brigade should have been calling for a radical change to resources and a dedicated discussion with the Mayor's office and the Cabinet office regarding funding to cope with major disasters. That discussion should have been directed at the question, what value do we place on the lives of our citizens, and how far are we prepared to pay for the protection of our people? In essence, that is the same discussion which lies at the heart of this inquiry and we will be examining in phase 2. The question there, as we continue into phase 2, is what price are we prepared to pay as a society to protect our own people from commercial greed, local authority cost-cutting, and institutional apathy? Unless we change our approach to the assessment of risk and include within that risk assessment the very people who will suffer the risk, when we come to the question of the expenditure of resources on equipment and training within such organisations as the LFB, then no doubt we will be here again at some point in the future confronting these same issues. The families we represent say stop and change. On their behalf, we say stop and change. No more fires that the LFB cannot deal with. Fund the emergency services properly and have leaders of these services in place that can exercise leadership, not denial. And so those are our submissions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stein. And you've done very well to finish by 4:30.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, that's obviously a good point to finish for today. So we'll break in just a moment. And we resume tomorrow with some more closing statements. According to my running order, we should be hearing from Mr. Menon first thing in the morning. Good. Well, thank you all very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. Thank you.